The New Mexico sun blazed mercilessly as Abigail "Abby" Fletcher stumbled through the desert scrub, her once elegant dress now torn and filthy, her lips cracked from thirst. At 46, the former Boston socialite had survived a loveless marriage, the death of her only child, and the scandal that had driven her west seeking redemption. But she'd never expected to be robbed and abandoned by the very outlaws she'd hired to escort her to California. The sun beat down on her exposed neck, burning skin that had never known such harsh treatment. Her fashionable boots, designed for Boston's cobblestone streets, had worn through at the soles, and each step sent sharp pain through her blistered feet. Still, she pressed on, driven by a stubborn refusal to die in this God-forsaken wilderness. "Fancy ladies got more grit than sense," Jake Murdoch had laughed as his gang rode off with her money, her jewelry, and her horse. "Should have stayed back east playing tea party with the other rich bitches." His words echoed in her mind as she trudged forward. The gang had seemed legitimate at first. Rough around the edges, certainly, but presenting themselves as experienced guides who specialized in escorting travelers through dangerous territory. Murdoch himself had been charming in a coarse way, tipping his hat and speaking with exaggerated politeness that Abby now recognized as mockery. The grit had been Abby's desperate attempt to start over after losing everything: her husband's suicide when his embezzlement was discovered, her daughter's death from consumption, the society friends who'd turned their backs when the Fletcher name became synonymous with shame. She'd liquidated what little remained and headed west, only to fall prey to men who saw her as easy pickings. Her husband, Edward's betrayal, had been the first shock. For 20 years, she'd believed him to be a respectable banker, only to discover he'd been stealing from his clients for over a decade. The night before his arrest, he'd swallowed his service revolver rather than face the consequences, leaving Abby to weather the storm of scandal and financial ruin alone. Then came Emily's illness, consumption that ravaged her 19-year-old body until she was nothing but skin and bones, coughing blood into handkerchiefs that Abby washed daily, pretending not to see the stains that never quite came out. Without money for proper medical care, Abby had watched helplessly as her daughter slipped away, taking the last of her reason to live with her final breath. "Desert'll finish what we started," Murdoch had called back. "Save us the trouble of putting a bullet in you." Now Abby crawled through the sage and prickly pear, her vision blurring from heat and dehydration. Her tongue felt swollen in her mouth, and each breath drew hot, dry air into lungs that ached for moisture. Twice she'd fallen, lacking the strength to rise immediately, and each time she'd forced herself back to her feet through sheer determination. In the distance, she spotted a ramshackle building nestled against a rocky outcrop, an old mining shack or line cabin, with a thin wisp of smoke rising from its chimney. The sight gave her renewed energy, and she staggered toward it, praying it wasn't a mirage born of desperation. The building grew more substantial as she approached. Weathered boards silvered by years of sun and wind, a small corral to one side holding a single dun-colored horse, a vegetable patch struggling to survive in the harsh climate. Signs of habitation, of civilization, of possible salvation. The door hung crooked on leather hinges, and Abby pushed through to find herself in a single room that served as kitchen, bedroom, and workshop. A figure hunched over a workbench looked up at her entrance. A man in his 50s, his face weathered by decades of desert sun, his hair gone completely white despite his relatively young age. A scar ran from his left temple to his jaw, puckering the skin around his eye. "Well, I'll be damned," he said, setting down the rifle he'd been cleaning. "What's a lady doing dying in my doorway?" His voice was rough but not unkind, carrying the distinctive drawl of someone who'd spent years in the Southwest. His clothes were worn but clean. Buckskin pants, a faded blue shirt with the sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle, and a leather vest that had seen better days. Abby tried to speak, but only managed to croak. The man, she'd later learn his name was Caleb, Ghost, Morrison, helped her to a chair and pressed a cup of water to her lips. His hands were calloused but gentle, steadying her when she would have gulped the precious liquid too quickly. "Easy now," he said gently. "Too much too fast, and you'll just bring it back up." She sipped slowly, feeling life return with each swallow. The water was cool and sweet, drawn from a well that tapped into an underground spring, a rare blessing in this arid landscape. When she'd drunk enough to ease her immediate thirst, Caleb offered her a plate of beans and salt pork. Simple fare that tasted better than any meal she'd eaten in Boston's finest restaurants. As her vision cleared, Abby took in her rescuer. He moved with the careful precision of someone who'd learned that survival depended on attention to detail. His clothes were patched but clean, his weapons well-maintained, and his pale blue eyes held the haunted look of a man who'd seen too much death. The cabin itself was sparse but orderly. A narrow cot occupied one corner, covered with a colorful Navajo blanket. Shelves lined the walls, holding books that surprised her, volumes of poetry, history, and philosophy alongside practical manuals on tracking, hunting, and survival. A pot of something savory simmered on the small iron stove, filling the space with a homey aroma that contrasted with the deadly arsenal hanging from pegs near the door. "Thank you," she whispered when she could finally speak. "Don't thank me yet," Caleb replied grimly. "This ain't exactly a hotel. What happened to you?" The story spilled out, the outlaws, the robbery, the long walk through the desert that should have killed her. She told him about Boston, about Edward's betrayal and Emily's death, about the desperate gamble that had led her to trust Jake Murdoch and his gang. Caleb listened without comment, occasionally nodding as if he'd heard similar tales before. "Murdoch's gang," he said when she finished. "They've been working this territory for months, preying on travelers who don't know better than to trust strangers." He rose and moved to a wanted poster tacked to the wall. One of many, she now noticed. Jake Murdoch's face stared back at them, alongside the words $500 reward and a list of crimes that included robbery, kidnapping, and murder. "You know them?" Abby asked, surprised. Caleb's expression darkened. "I know them. Been tracking them on and off for the better part of a year. They're slippery. Move between territories to avoid the law, change their patterns just enough to stay ahead of possess." He studied her with new interest, as if reassessing her value. "Question is, what are you going to do about it?" For 3 days, Abby recovered her strength while Caleb tended to his mysterious business. She learned he was a bounty hunter, one of the best in the territory, with a reputation for bringing in his quarry dead or alive, usually dead. His nickname came from his ability to appear and disappear like smoke, tracking men across impossible terrain and striking when they least expected it. During those days, Abby made herself useful, cleaning the cabin, mending Caleb's clothes, and preparing meals from his modest supplies. She found comfort in these domestic tasks, so different from the social obligations that had filled her days in Boston. Here, work had immediate purpose, survival rather than appearance. "Why do they call you Ghost?" Abby asked one evening as they shared a simple meal of beans and hardtack. Caleb paused, his spoon halfway to his mouth. "Because I hunt dead men," he replied matter-of-factly. "Men who should have been hanged years ago but slipped through the cracks. I make sure they don't slip any further." His story emerged slowly over the following days, shared in fragments during quiet evenings by the fire. He'd been a lawman once, a sheriff in a small town called Redemption that had been destroyed by the same kind of outlaws who'd robbed Abby. His wife Sarah and young son Thomas had been killed in the raid, and Caleb had spent the next decade hunting down every man responsible. "Got them all eventually," he said, staring into the fire, the flames reflecting in his pale eyes. "Tracked the last one to Mexico. Federales found him with his throat cut, sitting at a cantina table like he was just taking a nap." "Did it help?" Abby asked softly. "Killing them all?" Caleb considered the question, turning it over like a strange coin. "Not in the way I thought it would. Didn't bring my family back, just left me with a reputation and a skill set that ain't much good for anything but killing." "So why continue?" "Because someone has to. The law can't reach everywhere, and some men are too dangerous to let live." He looked at her directly. "Men like Murdoch, who leave women to die in the desert because it amuses them." When Abby was strong enough to travel, Caleb made an unexpected offer. "I'm going after Murdoch's gang anyway. They've got bounties on their heads from here to Texas. You want your property back, you can come along. But I warn you, it won't be pretty." Abby thought of the life she'd left behind. The empty social rituals, the whispers behind fans, the pitying glances from women who'd once called her friend. She thought of Edward's cowardice and Emily's courage in the face of death. She thought of Jake Murdoch's laughter as he rode away, leaving her to die. "I'm not looking for pretty," Abby replied, surprising herself with the steel in her voice. "I'm looking for justice." "Justice and revenge ain't the same thing," Caleb warned, studying her face. "Maybe not, but sometimes they point in the same direction." Their partnership began with a dangerous journey across the Chihuahuan desert, following tracks that only Caleb could read. He outfitted her with practical clothes, men's trousers that scandalized her at first but proved far more suitable for riding, a cotton shirt, a wide-brimmed hat to shield her from the sun, and sturdy boots that he'd traded for with a passing merchant. "First lesson," he told her as they set out. "Out here, practicality trumps propriety every time." Abby learned to ride like a man, to shoot straight, and to endure hardships that would have killed the pampered socialite she'd once been. Caleb proved a patient but demanding teacher, showing her how to read sign, how to conserve water, how to move silently through brush, and how to use a revolver, not the delicate lady's derringer she'd carried in Boston, but a Colt .45 that kicked like a mule but could stop a charging man in his tracks. The first time she hit a target at 50 paces, the satisfaction was unlike anything she'd felt before, pure and uncomplicated by social expectations or propriety. She was learning to survive in a world that didn't care about her pedigree or her past, only her ability to adapt and overcome. "You're tougher than you look," Caleb observed after she'd spent a full day in the saddle without complaint, despite muscles that screamed in protest. "I'm tougher than I knew," Abby replied, checking the loads in the pistol he'd taught her to use. The weight of it had become familiar, almost comforting, a tangible symbol of her transformation. They tracked Murdoch's gang to a box canyon where the outlaws had made camp, confident in their isolation. For 2 days, Caleb and Abby observed from a distance, learning their routines, identifying each member, noting their habits and weaknesses. "That one, the tall one with the red bandana, he's always the first on watch and the last to sleep," Abby whispered as they lay on a ridge overlooking the camp. "And the young one, he drinks too much every night." Caleb nodded approvingly. "Good eyes, you're learning." He studied the terrain with the eye of a professional killer, planning his approach with methodical precision. The canyon offered only one obvious entrance, but Caleb had spotted a narrow trail that wound down the back wall, treacherous but passable for someone who knew what they were doing. 6 men, well-armed, good defensive position, he murmured. "This is where you stay back and let me work." "Like hell," Abby replied. "They're my demons to face." "This ain't about facing demons. It's about staying alive long enough to see justice done." His voice softened. "I've already watched one woman I cared about die because of men like these. I won't watch another." The admission hung between them, unexpected and profound. Abby realized with a start that somewhere along their journey, their partnership had evolved into something deeper. Not quite love, perhaps, but a connection forged in shared purpose and mutual respect. "I'll be careful," she promised, "but I need to see this through." The attack came at dawn, when the outlaws were groggy and unprepared. Caleb moved like his nickname suggested, appearing from impossible angles to drop 2 men before they could reach their weapons. Abby provided covering fire from a rocky outcrop, her shots more accurate than anyone, including herself, had expected. The battle was brief but vicious. When the smoke cleared, 4 outlaws lay dead, and Jake Murdoch knelt in the dirt with Caleb's rifle pressed to his skull. Blood trickled from a wound on his temple, and his trademark arrogance had given way to naked fear. "Well, well," Murdoch sneered, recognizing Abby despite her transformation. "The fancy lady learned to bite." "I learned a lot of things," Abby replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins, including the difference between justice and mercy. "You gonna kill me then? Prove you're as hard as you pretend?" Abby studied the man who'd left her to die in the desert, who'd laughed at her desperation and stolen everything she had left. A part of her wanted to pull the trigger, to end his miserable life as payment for all the suffering he'd caused. Instead, she stepped back. "Now, that's what separates us from animals like you." Caleb bound Murdoch's hands, and they began the long journey back to the nearest town with a sheriff's office. Along the way, they recovered Abby's stolen property, her money, her jewelry, and personal items that held sentimental value, including a locket containing a lock of Emily's hair. Murdoch died anyway, shot while trying to escape during the journey back to town. Caleb's report listed it as justifiable homicide, and no one questioned the word of the territory's most respected bounty hunter. "Feel better?" Caleb asked, as they watched the undertaker load Murdoch's body onto a wagon. "Feel different," Abby replied. "Like I've shed an old skin and grown a new one." Their partnership evolved beyond the hunt for Murdoch's gang. Abby discovered she had a talent for tracking and investigation, while Caleb found that having a partner made the lonely work of bounty hunting more bearable. They became a formidable team, hunting the worst criminals across the Southwest. More importantly, they found in each other something they'd both thought lost forever: companionship, understanding, and the slow-burning warmth of love built on shared danger and mutual respect. "We make an odd pair," Abby observed one evening as they camped under a canopy of desert stars, her head resting on his shoulder. "The best partnerships usually do," Caleb replied, his arm around her shoulders. "Two broken people making each other whole." At 47, Abigail Fletcher was no longer the desperate socialite who'd fled Boston in shame. She was a bounty hunter, a partner, and living proof that sometimes the worst betrayals lead to the greatest discoveries about yourself. The desert that had nearly killed her had instead forged her into something harder and more dangerous than she'd ever imagined. A woman who'd learned that justice sometimes required taking the law into your own hands, and that the most unlikely partnerships or ships often created the strongest bonds. And Caleb Morrison had found something he'd thought died with his family. Not just love, but purpose beyond revenge. Partnership with someone who understood that survival in the frontier required both courage and the wisdom to know when killing was necessary and when mercy was stronger. Together, they'd carved out their own brand of justice in the lawless territories, proving that sometimes the people society discards become the ones who protect it from its worst elements. Their reputation spread from the Rio Grande to the Colorado Rockies. Ghost Morrison and the Lady Hunter, bringing justice to places where the law feared to tread. The bounties they collected made them wealthy, but the partnership they'd forged made them whole. In a land where second chances were rare and redemption had to be earned at gunpoint, they'd found both in each other's arms.